Okay, and we're live. Hi everyone, welcome back, especially welcome back if you have just come from watching my end of the month film and TV wrap up. For those who are new here, my name is Nicki, I'm an author and editor, and I post videos here on YouTube about writing, editing, reading, and all the other things I love. And today we are here for an end of the month reading wrap up. It is early, I know, a week early, but the reason being I am expecting broadband, the National Broadband Network, to be installed here at my house in the next week or two, and there will probably be at least a few days, hopefully not too much more, but there will be some disruption to my internet service, I imagine, during that time. So I thought while I was able to free up a minute to do these live streams today, it was probably better to get them done, and then if I am without internet for a little while at the end of the month, it's not the end of the world, because at least I've got some of these things done and dusted. So hopefully by the time I'm back in June, everything will be working, all the new stuff will be plugged in and going, and it should officially be a better speed in that than I'm getting now, but we'll wait and see, because I've heard some mixed reviews about it. So we will find out in any case. But for now, I am here just to do a quick reading wrap up for the end of May. After this, I have to go off and clean my house, so I mustn't drag on too long, else I will not get the cleaning done before dinner. Luckily, it is a slightly lighter reading month for me. I've read a few slightly longer works, so I've only got about 15, I think, to get through. So we're going to kick straight off. First up is Killing Commendatore by Murakami Haruki, one of my favourite Japanese authors. And Killing Commendatore is a 5-star read for me. I really loved it. It's, as with all Murakami's stories, it's a fairly quirky scenario. We have a portrait painter who's just getting divorced, who goes off to stay in a friend's house for a short period while he gets his life back on track. And the house actually belongs to the friend's father, who's now in a nursing home, who was a very famous painter himself. He finds an interesting portrait wrapped up in the loft called Killing Commendatore. And there's a whole sort of strange tale spun around this with the slightly odd guy who lives nearby in a white mansion, a young girl who comes to his art classes he starts giving, who is connected to the stranger in the mansion. There's a strange bell that keeps ringing in the woods, buried beneath the earth, and various other amusing and intriguing figures pop up along the way. It's one of those books I can't really tell you too much about the story because it will just ruin it. I am going to get rid of this banner quickly, but if you're a Murakami fan, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's a fairly hefty work, so it's perhaps not the first one you should read if you're new to his writing, but definitely if you've already read a few, I recommend this one. And sticking with Murakami Haruki, I read a couple more. I'm actually in the process of trying to read through all the ones of his I haven't gotten to yet. I think after the two I'm about to mention, I think I've only got 2 left, 1 or 2 left, so I'm nearly there. So the next one I read this month was Dance, Dance, Dance. This is another really entertaining and intriguing story. There's a bit of a murder mystery that goes on. We've got some quirky characters of a psychic teenage girl, a movie star. There's a lot of stuff wrapped up in escorts and prostitution and various things going on. Again, like, it doesn't ruin it if I tell you too much of the plot, but it was really entertaining. Kept me turning the pages from start to finish, and I mean, it was another 5-star read for me. I mean, Germany Murakami for me is always 4 and 5 stars because I just love his writing. Which brings us to the final book of his I read for May, which was Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. This is, I think, without a doubt, the quirkiest of Murakami's books that I have read, and I imagine it will be the quirkiest overall now. I've only got a couple to go. It's an absolute bizarre story, and it's really 2 stories. There are sort of 2 plots going on, and at first you don't see what connection they have, but once you get about 2/3 through, the links between them become clearer, and everything pulls together really nicely. This is one, again, it's really impossible to explain. I think if you read The Wild Sheep Chase first, it'd probably help. I wouldn't come to this one unless you've read that one, because there are a bit of overlap. There is a bit of overlap going on between them. But again, this was a 5-star read for me, naturally. Next up is another favourite author of mine, and that's Sjón, who's an Icelandic author. And this is his work, CoDex 1962. Now, most of his books have been novellas, and I've absolutely adored them. They have a wonderful sense of magical realism, these really memorable, captivating stories. And this is a longer work. It's just over 500 pages. So it's a real proper novel this time. And I was really excited to give it a go, having loved those shorter works so much. For me, though, this ended up being a bit of a mix. There were things I loved about it. The first part, it's a story in 3 parts, essentially. And it is very heavy on the magical realism again. The first part I really got into. I found the story and the characters engaging, and I was absolutely with it for the whole way through. When we moved into part 2, I found part 2 a little bit difficult. There were times when I just wanted to know what the hell was going on. And I began to lose interest a little bit. We got into part 3, which changed again. And I did perk up a little bit. I got a bit more interested once again in part 3. But it just didn't 100% come together for me. And I don't know why that is. The writing was great as always. The story idea was absolutely zany and brilliant. It's a very lyrical piece. But I will say I've not been sleeping well lately. And I was very tired. And I read this just before I go to bed. And I do wonder whether perhaps it required more concentration than I was able to give it as we moved into part 2. And perhaps it's my fault. So I do want to give it the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I'm still giving it 4 stars because there were plenty of things I liked about it. It just didn't quite have that absolute magic for me that some of his other shorter works have done. If you haven't read anything by Sjón, I do recommend that you check out his novellas first, because I think coming to this book as a first time getting into his writing would be a bit difficult. So try some of the shorter stuff first before you attempt this one. And next up, I read The Art of the Rise of Skywalker by Szostak. So I had the previous 2 books, Art of Force Awakens and Art of the Last Jedi. So I just wanted this one to complete the collection, essentially. It's a 4.5-star read for me. There's some really lovely illustrations. It's great to see some of the concepts behind things that appeared in the movie and things that didn't make it in. As with previous ones, I kind of found myself wishing some stuff had been included. And I know with the previous 2 books, they released before the movies, so they kept spoilers out of it, and they included that information in the next book. So in this book, we have some spoiler type stuff from The Last Jedi that got missed out of the last book. But I just felt it was not nicely balanced at times between what was shown and what wasn't, which is the only reason it gets 4.5 and not 5 stars for me. But if you're a Star Wars fan, it's a really nice book to add to collection, to have those 3 volumes for the final part, or the final trilogy of this trilogy of trilogies. Don't know what we're going to call that, but anyway, that's what it was. And it was 4.5 stars, and it is good for fans. If you don't know anything about the movies, it will mean nothing to you. But if you have read the movies, if you've seen the movies, then you will want to read this book. So moving on, that's the end of all the books that I received as gifts or bought for myself. So we're moving on to the publisher donated ones now. So first up, 2 books I received as free print arcs from Pan Macmillan, Australia. The first of these is Breast and Eggs by Kawakami Mieko. Now this is my first time reading this author's works, and overall I liked it. It's a kind of feminist story in some ways, talks about mother and daughter relationships, views of gender, workplace sexual harassment. There's a few big topics and big things going on in this book, essentially. For me, this was a 4.5-star read. I loved the first part, and I think what I want to mention about this book is that the first part was originally a novella, and then the author decided to extend the story into a novel. So the part 1 of the book is the original novella, and part 2 is the extension of the story, continuation of the story. Part 1 is a really tight, beautifully written piece. It's wonderfully paced. Everything comes together so perfectly. Part 2, I found a little bit meandering. It wasn't as tight and nicely structured as part 1, and you could really tell that they'd been written separately, which is the reason that I couldn't quite give it 5 stars because although I still enjoyed part 2, it wasn't as good as part 1. But definitely, if you're interested in contemporary Japanese literature, this is one to take a look at. And sticking with all things Japanese, the other book I received from Pan Macmillan Australia was Tokyo by Wyndham Mackintosh. Now, this is a kind of guidebook / cultural guide. So it's a kind of travel guide in a sense, but it includes a lot of cultural information about Japan at the same time. I thought this was absolutely brilliant. I'm giving it a 5-star rating. It's so entertaining. It's giving you a lot of good information, but rather than, say, the Lonely Planet guides, which are looking at where can you sleep, where can you eat, and all the how do you get from the airport to the city kind of stuff. This one, it talks a little bit about places to eat, but it's more a cultural guide, so places to go and see that will show you different elements of traditional Japan, modern Japan. It was split into categories in that manner. Beautifully illustrated, really nicely designed and presented. And this is definitely a book I could go back to again and again and just keep dipping into and just reading bits of interest, particularly when I start planning my trip, which should have happened this year, but because of coronavirus has now been postponed until whenever we can finally travel to Japan again. But I'll definitely check it out, check out this book again just before I go for a few more final tips. And finally, once I've had a quick drink, so my voice is going, that brings me on to the final 8 books of the month, all of which I received from NetGalley. So, kicking us off, Monstrous Heart by Claire McKenna. This was an interesting piece. In some ways, I'd call it a kind of Beauty and the Beast sort of story, although not exactly. Basically, it's a bit of a fantasy element of a woman who has magical blood that allows her to control the flame in the lighthouse, and she's sent off to this town to run the lighthouse after the previous occupant passes away. And her neighbour is the town pariah, who's a man who's accused of seducing women, killing his wife, and various other nefarious deeds. But she sees him differently as she gets to know him. I don't want to say too much more because it would spoiler it. This was a 3-star read for me. There were things that I loved about it, but at the end of the day, it didn't quite come together in a way I would have liked. In particular, the relationship between the two of them, it felt a little bit forced and sudden. I didn't really feel it was natural and made sense. And there were just some other issues as well to do with the world building, which there were times when I had questions that I wanted to know more about the world, the setting, what was happening in the background, and we never really got that. So it's a middle of the road for me. If you're interested in those kind of stories, so sort of fantasy takes, a bit of a fairy tale-esque feel, then you might want to check it out. The next book I read is the first in a series, and the book is called The Girl and the Stars by Mark Lawrence. It's a fantasy tale. Essentially, there's all these clans who live in a frozen north, and once a year they all gather together, and any child from any of the clans who's deemed unfit, not got suitable genes to carry on the line, is thrown down this pit, essentially. And when her brother gets tossed down there, our heroine jumps after him, only to discover things are not quite what she thought. She meets a band of other people down there, and it becomes a bit of a tribal warfare down there, but also with influence of things still going on up on the surface. Again, I don't want to spoiler too much, but I found it a really engaging tale. I loved the characters. The premise is really nicely handled. The world building was good. I got enough information without all the info dumping. It was well presented. As we needed information, we got it. And I'd definitely be interested in reading on in this series. It was a 4-star read for me. Next up was The Glasstown Wars by Celia Rees. Now, this book jumped out at me on NetGalley because it said it was based on, some juvenile writing by the Brontes. And I think I went into it with certain expectations and none of those were quite met. It's a really bizarre story. Perhaps I should begin by saying I gave it 2.5 stars. I thought it had some fascinating ideas. The concept behind it was really clever and had a lot of promise, but it just didn't quite come together for me. I always wanted more. I wanted to understand the world more. The characters felt a little bit two-dimensional. Relationships felt a bit forced, and it just kind of went all over the place. I think it could have done with a bit of tighter editing on the structure and things like that, maybe. But I guess it just didn't work for me overall. So if you're intrigued, give it a try, but it's not something I'm going to rush to ever read again. Next up was an LGBT story, Time Waits by C.B. Lewis. This is a time travel kind of story. In the future, there's a group of people who go back and forth in time and monitor things, try to work out why certain events took place, but without altering them. And one day a soldier from the time period they're visiting ends up falling through, a very injured soldier, falling through the door into their time. And a bit of a romance ensues, essentially, with one of the young researchers. Meanwhile, a sort of break-off group wants to go back and alter time. So there's a bit of a race against the clock and a bit of an adventure story trying to stop them. So this was a 3-star read for me. I really loved, again, the premise. I thought it was a great idea. The characters, I kind of struggled a little bit with some of the characterization. And in the same way, the romance, again, it just didn't quite click with me. Once the sex scene started, there were quite a few of them, which doesn't bother me as long as they're necessary and they add something to the story. But after the first one, I didn't think they really had any great benefit to the storytelling or the characters. And it's not a bad book, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It was entertaining enough. There were some flaws, some things I didn't like about it, but overall, if you like the sound of a time travel romance with a bit of action and adventure, then it's worth taking a look at Time Waits by C.B. Lewis. Next up, I read volume 1 of a manga series, Koimonogateri by Tagura Tohru. So this is, again, LGBT. This first volume, I gave it 3 stars. I liked the characters a lot. I liked the premise. I did think some of the characters were very similar looking, which was a bit confusing at times when you're trying to tell who's saying what and who's talking to who, when they looked very nearly identical, a couple of them. And also the pacing in this piece is very, very slow. Not a huge amount happens in this first volume. And I'm guessing it's one of those stories that will take off a bit once you get into volume 2 and 3 and things start happening. But I didn't think it was the best of hooks to get people to keep reading because there wasn't a great deal of action in this first volume. But that being said, if I had an opportunity to read volume 2, I probably would take a look at it and see how the story carries on and whether it's worth reading further from there. Next up, we're near the end. Where Dreams Descend by Janellea. This is a kind of historical fantasy story. So it's set in a kind of what feels like a 1920s-ish world, but magic exists. And our main character is a magician in this little out of town, essentially a kind of club, a little bit of a risque club. And she's the main attraction for the entertainment in this club. But she's got big dreams and she finds out there's a magic show taking place in the closest town. So she runs away to take part in the magic show. She discovers along the way female magicians are not well looked upon. It's a male profession. And when things start happening at the competition, people go missing or turn up dead. And there's a lot of weird stuff going on, which we haven't quite at this point got to the bottom of what's happening because this is a 2-part story. There's going to be a second book. Overall, I gave this one 3 stars. It's got a little bit of a run of 3 stars at the moment, but I loved the premise again, which is what drew me to request the book and want to read it. I liked the characters. Again, the romance in this one felt a little bit forced. Didn't feel natural, but the story left me wondering what's going to happen next and how it's all going to conclude. There were a few issues with, for example, like, is she going to win the competition? And yet the author tells us that she's absolutely way better than everyone else. And there's no way she wouldn't be the best magician there, which kind of ruins the suspense about whether she's going to win the competition. So there's a few little things like that that kind of niggled at me. But overall, I did find the story entertaining, and I do want to find out what will happen when it concludes. Next up, I read Signs and Symbols by D.R. McElroy. So this is a book, supposedly a book of over 1,000 symbols explained. I liked the way the book was split into categories. It kept everything nice and simple. Visually, it looked pretty good. However, I only gave this book 3 stars, and the reason for that, essentially, was that I found a piece of information in there that is incorrect, which really jumped out at me as being wrong. And it did make me question, well, if this is wrong, is other stuff in here wrong as well? The book's a little bit skewed towards the US. It said world symbols, but in certain categories, there was a US focus, although in others they did look in a broader spectrum. If you're into signs and symbols and things like that, it's probably worth having a look at this book, but I'd just be a little bit wary because, as I said, I did notice that there was incorrect information in there. And finally, the last book of the month is The Silver Serpents by Roshani Chokshi. And this is a sequel to The Gilded Dwarves, which I read a short while ago, and is the second in a trilogy. I really enjoyed the continuation of the story. This was a 4.5-star read for me. I thought it picked up well from the end of the first book. It was great to spend time with those characters again. A couple of excellent new characters were introduced that I really loved getting to know. And it all ended in a manner in which leaves me eager for book 3, let's say. I'm not going to talk too much about the plot because you do need to have read Gilded Dwarves first to understand what's going on. I thought it continued well. It was nicely paced. There was plenty of action and adventure. And I'm definitely very excited to see how the story will conclude when the final book comes out. So on that note, I will close. I'm about where I wanted to be time-wise. I now need to hurry up and go and do my cleaning. Joy of joys, I know, but after cleaning, I'm going to get Korean fried chicken takeaway. So something to look forward to when I finish. Anyway, as I said, we'll end there for now. I should be back at the end of June with these vlogs again, as per my normal schedule. All being well, we should all be sorted out and everything in place with the new internet by then. I am supposed to be doing a live stream with my good friend Alina for our Drama Talk series in early June, which, fingers crossed, everything will be sorted out and organised in time for that. I have a couple of vlogs already scheduled in early June, so they'll go ahead regardless of my internet, so there's no issue there. But hopefully, as I said, in a few weeks, we'll be back to normal, and I will look forward to talking to you all again very soon. And I come back at the end of June to tell you what else I've been reading and watching and enjoying. So, hope you're all keeping safe and well. I will end there for now, but that's about all I can say. Just that I don't know why I'm doing this today, honestly. My brain is like complete fuzz. I'm just going to say goodbye. I'm leaving now. Bye, everyone.